Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments. So I want to expand on a discussion that I brought up in one of my earlier videos about the three different types of collectible markets, or the categories that we place different collecting categories, different antique collecting categories under. And those three markets are speculative, established, and mature. Now, this is a very important understanding as to how the antiques and collectibles trade operates. And ironically, I didn't learn this concept until literally the year 1996. Now, to be fair, I graduated high school in 1995. I've been active in the antiques and collectibles trade since the age of 12. And I was very lucky because when I started out in the trade, I had a lot of great mentors that would show me the ropes. And a lot of these guys were very, very sophisticated dealers that were in either the low-end or the high-end markets of the antiques and collectibles trade. For instance, when I started out, I started going to flea markets, antique marts, yard sales, garage sales, and I would buy pop culture-based collectibles, and I would flip them either through other dealers or I would sell them through classified ads. Then when the internet became a thing, I started adopting to e-commerce very quickly. In fact, when 1995, when eBay premiered, I was already a senior in high school. I graduated June of that year. I started really heavily selling on eBay to the point where I was making literally tens of thousands of dollars just by flipping pre-Nintendo video game systems, Beanie Babies, Pez dispensers, vintage comic books, pop culture-based collectibles on eBay for a tremendous profit. And I was able to turn that into a substantial business that lasted roughly for 10 years, and eventually I did sell the business. More on that in another video. I'm not going to go into specifics in this particular video, but make no mistake, that's pretty much where I got the money that I have today. It was basically through e-commerce, my knowledge of the antiques and collectibles trade, and also the sale of that business. Now, ironically, I was lucky in that I lived in the great state of Pennsylvania, which I still reside in. And literally from 40 to 50 minutes from my house is the town of Adamstown, Pennsylvania, which is billed in a lot of the literature as the antiques capital of the United States. Now, it was there that I met some of my mentors who taught me the high-end market for antiques, collectibles, antiquities, coins, currency, historical documents, firearms, antique glass, antique pottery, antique furniture, antique bottles, all these esoteric markets that are very established and very mature. And a lot of these markets, it's not uncommon to see items sell for $50,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars or more. So I had exposure to both markets. Now, one of the criticisms that I get on this channel is that I'm too biased towards antiques. And I always laugh at that statement because, ironically, I started in pop culture collectibles. I have a love affair with vintage comic books, vintage video games, vintage toys, a lot of pop culture-based collectibles. That's why if you've seen certain rooms of my house where I have Lego on display along with traditional antiques, glassware. I also have a lot of vintage advertising. I have certain pieces of art that is hung up throughout the house along with vintage advertising. And of course, my passion is collectible coins, currency, historical documents, certain pieces of art, traditional antiques, edged weapons, firearms, items of that nature. Well, that didn't occur by accident. That happened because I had exposure to those items, and I had a lot of very well-educated mentors who spent countless hours with me teaching me how to identify those items and how to establish them as valid alternative assets. So I was very lucky in that sense. So I recognized that a lot of my viewing audience didn't have that same exposure growing up. So I understand why they're tempted with Pokemon cards or Magic the Gathering cards or vintage video games or some of these other more speculative assets where the barrier to entry is quite low. Because in order to get into coins, currency, firearms, all these sophisticated markets, whether we're talking about the high-end art market, you really have to be prepared to spend a lot of money and take an adequate amount of risk if you yourself are not educated in those markets. That's why I try to do a lot of videos on this channel, guys, where I talk about rare coin investing, or I talk about currency, or I introduce you guys to how the high-end art market works, because even if you don't have the money to play in that market, at least you're getting exposure to it so you can apply some of that knowledge to some of these more speculative collectible markets that exist. And I'm not bashing collectibles at all. I mean, let's be realistic. There are collectibles out there that sell for 6 figures or more. I mean, if you have an Alpha Edition Black Lotus card graded by BGS in 9.0, 9.5 condition, that card alone is worth over $100,000 to this day. So there are items that are very high-end, very sought after in the collectible side of the trade. But in my opinion, the best way to learn these markets is, even if you start off in the collectible side of the trade, try to get exposure to some of these other markets and learn how they operate. And one of the things you're going to see is most antique markets, not all, we're going to talk about this in this video, not all antique markets, but most of these markets for antiques are cyclical, where pop culture markets tend to come and go and or die off or change as they become established and or mature. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people realize or talk about. You know, when we look at the market for vintage comic books, a lot of you guys right now are ultra focused on the big keys, superhero comic books. But what you don't understand is, back when comic books were considered a speculative market, back in the 1970s, even the 1960s to a certain degree, and the 1980s, some of the big keys at that time, yes, they were superhero based, but some of them also were in the horror realm, meaning some of your EC comics started to accelerate in value. Well, today, it's interesting how the market changed, where the market values superhero comics more than horror comics. And that's an example as to what happens when a speculative market starts to emerge and develop into a more established market. The market changes overall. And that's why I warn a lot of these people that are going after graded video games, vintage video games, Magic the Gathering, Pokemon. These markets, once they do become established, they're going to change. And with that change comes price increases and price decreases. So if you're not properly diversified in some of these collecting categories, you're really going to get taken for a loop. And what I mean by that, there's a lot of people that are going to lose money over the long term in a lot of these collecting categories. So it's best to have exposure if you are building a portfolio of alternate assets, which is really what the antiques and collectibles trade is, in addition to a strong financial portfolio. Because remember, if you're going to get involved in the antiques and collectibles trade from the investment side of the trade, you want to be established already financially. You want to have a strong foundation of financial assets, whether that's stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, real estate. Whatever you want to put in that portfolio, you should already be established before you come in and start playing with alternate asset classes. And that goes for Bitcoin, that goes for silver, that goes for gold, that goes for commodities. Whatever you're investing in, you should already be established financially. Now, when these markets start to mature, there are changes that take place, fundamental changes. For instance, back in the year 1995, when I was selling on eBay, if you would mention the word vintage video game, it meant something different back then than what it means today. Back in 1995, vintage video games automatically referred to Atari, Intellivision, ColecoVision, Vectrex, Commodore, Apple computers, because back in 1995, the Nintendo Entertainment System was literally only 10 years old. It came out in 1985. So vintage video games has kind of taken on a different meaning over the years. And if you recall, back in 1995, a lot of your high-end items that were selling in the video game realm were Atari, Intellivision, ColecoVision. There were games, I remember, for the Atari 2600 mint and box that were selling for close to $1,000 at one point. And people were really thinking that that was the next big thing. And I was lucky because I had exposure to a lot of great mentors that analyzed these markets for me. And they came to me and they said, this is not going to last, Sean. Be very careful. I understand today You are making tens of thousands of dollars, if not upwards of six figures, in some of these markets. But rest assured, at some point, these markets are going to change. And with it is going to cause a collapse of prices for some items and an increase in prices for others. And if you're not careful, you're going to be left with your pants down. And you're not going to know what markets are which. And that's when I really started to branch out and I started to get involved in some of these more established and mature markets. So I was lucky when one of my mentors took me into his house and he said, hey, I'm going to show you the different types of collectible markets. Speculative, established, and mature. And he pulled out a piece of paper and he wrote 3 columns. The first column he wrote speculative, the second column he wrote established, and the third column he wrote mature. And this is exactly what he said to me. He said to me, Sean, if a market has only become collectible in the last 30 years, it's a speculative market. Automatically. It doesn't matter when the item was first produced. It matters when the item first became collectible. He says if the item has become collectible only in the last 30 years, it's a speculative market. If the item has been established and people are collecting it, they were collecting it before. If you analyze the market, you're going to notice it probably changed a little bit. Prices increased, prices decreased. It probably went through a speculative bubble if it isn't already in a speculative bubble. If an item has been collected for anywhere from 31 to 50 years, it's an established market. So he took out a pen and under speculative market, he wrote video games, he wrote vintage toys, he wrote most pop culture collectibles. When we got to the column for established collectibles, he wrote comic books. He then said to me, Sean, a mature collecting market is one that has been collected for 50 or more years. So an item that would be a mature, established collectible, not to confuse it with other collecting categories, we're talking about mature here, he would write coins, currency, firearms, traditional antiques, antique furniture, antique bottles, high-end art, all these markets that have been collected for over 50 years go on the mature side of the trade. And he looked at me and he said, the problem is with most speculators coming into these markets, they like items with a low barrier to entry. They want to believe, and this was back in 1996, 1995, 1996, guys, when the comic book boom was still going strong. And he said right out, he said most of these people want to come into these markets, they want to go to their local comic book store, they want to go to their baseball card store, and they want to spend as little as possible on a mass-produced item. They want to put it in a room, and they want to think in their mind that it's going to finance their retirement or their kids' college educations. And he looked at me and he said, that's everything that's wrong with the antiques and collectibles trade. That's why so many people come into these markets and they claim that the antique and collectibles market is a scam. Because the barrier to entry for pop culture items is so low that everybody enters at that side of the trade, they stay there, and they think they're going to make a fortune on these items. And to be fair, fortunes can be made on those items. Even today, guys, if you look at Scott Pratt, SM Pratt, if you look at Rudy with Alpha Investments, those guys are very successful in the Magic the Gathering and the Pokemon marketplaces. Now, I would never try to replicate their success. It's just not for me. But in the realm that they're operating in, they have done an excellent job at creating short-term and long-term wealth in those markets. I give them all the credit in the world. That being said, the average person is not able to realistically do that. And the problem is, there's a lot of people that come into my comment section thinking they're going to be the next Alpha Investments or the next SM Pratt, when all analytical intelligence should state that that's highly unlikely. And that's really what gets to the crux of this, where if you really want to build long-term wealth through diversification in the antiques and collectibles trade, you really have to go after more established and mature markets and limit your long-term exposure to speculative markets. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand, Because when a speculative market starts to gain steam, it usually ends up in a speculative bubble. And you have people paying $10,000 for an item like a vintage graded video game, of which there's no fundamentals that dictate that that item should be selling for $10,000. Now, there's one thing that I do want to caution people when you start to group collecting categories in these terms: speculative, established, mature. When you start to do this, you do have to understand that just because a collecting category is considered mature does not mean people will actively seek it out in another 50 or 100 years. Most of the markets in the mature side of the equation are very stable. We're talking coins, currency, first edition collectible books, historical documents, high-end artwork, antiquities, edged weapons, firearms, antique furniture, traditional antiques. Those markets are extremely stable. However, a market like cast iron collectibles, mechanical banks, stamps, those markets would also fall under the banner of mature collecting categories. And if you look at what those markets are doing today, they're actually losing steam overall in the trade. So just because a collecting category is defined as mature doesn't mean it's the best market to invest in long-term, short-term, or even for the medium future. So you have to be careful because you still have to do your research. So just because you analyze a market for coins and currency, and most people don't realize this, people have been collecting U.S. coins for over 100 years. Literally, the market has existed literally for hundreds of years. That's why if you watch some of my videos on coin collecting, I will occasionally hold up a proof coin that was minted in the 1800s that there's only like 975 pieces known to exist. Well, ironically, the U.S. Mint back then was making collectible coins in proof format that people were paying a premium for just for the collectible market. So people have been collecting coins for hundreds of years. Now that market is very, very mature. It's going strong. It's ironically in a bull market at present time because of the economic situation due to the pandemic and what's going on in the world at present time as a result of the virus. However, some other markets, like if we talk about stamps, stamps are kind of in a ho-hum doldrum right now, where there's not a lot of new blood going after stamps. Stamp collecting is one of those markets where third-party grading is trying to revive it at present time, but it's going to take a lot of work to get it back to where it was just 10 or 20 years ago. So I hope this video has served you well. If it didn't, please let me know in the comment section. If you want me to expand on this, I can. Believe it or not, the first cut of this video that I did was 47 minutes long. I actually took a lot of content out to get it down to 18 minutes long because most people don't watch my videos past 10 minutes. I hate to say that, guys, but it's the truth. If there's anything else you want to know, let me know in the comments below, and I will follow it up, possibly in another video. Thank you, stay safe, and to all my new subscribers, welcome. I hope you enjoy the content that I produce.